In the deepest histories of Middle-earth, two dark lords rose to dominate through fear and power. People still whispered their names around fires. Morgoth, who sought to unmake the world itself, and Sauron, whose corruption nearly brought all living beings under his shadow. While both sought dominion over all things, their methods would diverge, and the student would surpass the master through paths his teacher never dreamed of taking. From the beginning of time, when the world was young and the first stars were still new, Morgoth, who would later be named Morgoth, his raw power exceeded all others among the Valar, the divine beings sent by Eru Ilúvatar to shape Middle-earth according to the great vision of its creator. His voice spoke chaos, where others sang of light and growth. Morgoth's themes in the great music sought to dominate, turning harmonies into discord and weaving darkness into every note. When Ole crafted the mountains and valleys, Yavanna nurtured the first seeds of life, and Manwë shaped the winds and clouds that would dance across the skies. Morgoth rose to unmake their works. He burned Yavanna's forests to ash, turned Ulmo's living seas to ice, and smashed Aule's mountains to dust. His impatience with the slow unfolding of Ilúvatar's plan and his desire to dominate drove him to acts of increasing malice. During the years of the Lamps, as the Valar worked to shape Arda according to Ilúvatar's vision, Morgoth established his dominion in the frozen north. While his brethren raised two great pillars crafted by Aule and blessed by Varda to illuminate Middle-earth, he delved deep into the darkness, raising Utumno, his first stronghold, like a crown of black thorns against the sky. Each spire seemed to pierce the heavens themselves, wreathed in perpetual storms that he crafted as a mockery of Manwë's winds. Within these impenetrable walls, he gathered his strength and began his first experiments in corruption, breeding creatures of shadow and flame. Here walked the Balrogs, once noble Maya who had sung in the choirs of creation, now transformed into beings of darkness and terror. Between the mighty beacons of light, the other Valar built their first dwelling, Almaran, believing themselves secure in their creation. Like a shadow that had waited endless ages to strike, Melkor seized his moment. He assaulted and shattered the pillars, and the very foundations of Arda buckled and broke beneath them. Mountains burst from the earth like spears thrust through silk, their jagged peaks tearing the sky itself. Seas rushed into the wounds of the world, drowning ancient forests that had known only light since their first growth. Almaran crumbled as the land beneath it split and shifted like broken pottery. Ages passed, and in the time that followed, the years of the trees, the first children of Ilúvatar awakened beneath the stars of Varda. It was then that Morgoth's servants, ranging far from Utumno's gates, discovered these newly awakened elves. From these first captures, he discovered something that delighted his twisted mind. Their immortal nature meant they could endure torments that would have granted lesser beings the mercy of death. In Utumno's deepest chambers, he began his most terrible work, the creation of the orcs. Here, in dungeons that would echo with torment for ages to come, he twisted and corrupted the captured elves. New captives would witness the fate that awaited them through the twisted forms of those who came before. The first orcs, warped reflections of the elves they once were, retained just enough of their original nature to understand the horror of their transformation, a cruel reminder of what they had lost and what they had become. Their once musical voices, now harsh with malice, served as living testimonies to Morgoth's power to corrupt even the most beautiful of Ilúvatar's creations. As Morgoth bent all his power toward destruction and corruption, one of his servants stood in the shadows, studying every act of devastation, memorizing every method of domination, learning not just his master's strengths, but more crucially his weaknesses. This was Sauron, once a Maya in the service of Ole the Smith. Where others saw only destruction in Morgoth's works, Sauron's mind, honed by his time in the forges of creation, recognized patterns and possibilities. While Gothmog, Lord of Balrogs, was content merely to master fire and shadow, and Glaurung, Father of Dragons, existed purely as an engine of destruction, Sauron studied with clockmaker's precision the fundamental laws that govern both creation and corruption. His time serving Ole had taught him how things were built, the precise ways in which materials could be shaped, how forces could be balanced, how seemingly separate elements could be bound together into something greater. Under Morgoth, he learned how these same principles could be turned toward domination, or perhaps even perfection. This unique combination would be more dangerous than either force alone. Sauron had fought alongside Morgoth since before the counting of days, when the Dark Lord first raised his rebellion against the music of the Ainur. Through the devastating war for the sake of the elves, he served as Morgoth's most cunning lieutenant, watching as the Valar's armies laid siege to Utumno and finally cast his master into the void. For 3 ages, Morgoth remained chained in the halls of Mandos, bound by the mighty chains of Anganor, while Sauron retreated into the shadows of Middle-earth, observing and waiting. Later, through centuries of carefully crafted repentance and false humility, Morgoth won his release and returned to Valinor, the new dwelling of the Valar. In a single night, he slew Finwë, High King of the Noldor, shattered the vaults of Feanor, and seized the 3 Silmarils. Then, with Ungoliant at his side, he struck at the heart of Valinor itself, poisoning and destroying the 2 trees, plunging the realm into darkness for the first time since its creation. As Morgoth's armies now lay siege to the great elven realms of Beleriand, hammering at the gates of men and elves with overwhelming force, Sauron led and learned. Each battle, each siege, each confrontation revealed the limitations of pure force, even when wielded by a being of immense power. It was in his conquest of the Isle of Tol Sirion that Sauron found the perfect laboratory for his experiments in domination. On this corrupted isle, once the sacred Minas Tirith, Sauron built a laboratory of the soul. Strange tales spoke of those who entered his chambers. They didn't return as twisted creatures like Morgoth's orcs. No, they walked out looking exactly as they had entered, save for the hollow look in their eyes and a newfound devotion to darkness. Rumors spread that each level of Sauron's tower was carefully designed. In the lightless bottom chambers, prisoners would hear nothing but the voices of those already turned to Sauron's will. These broken servants would whisper endlessly about the peace they had found in submission. Resistance brought only pain, they would murmur in the darkness. Acceptance brought understanding. As prisoners ascended the tower, through corrupted Palantiri, Sauron would show real visions twisted to break the strongest hearts. A loyal captain would see his king feasting while he starved in chains, not knowing the scene was from years past. A faithful husband would witness his wife in another's company, the innocent moment stripped of its true context. In their isolation, these carefully crafted lies became more real than truth itself. In the tower's highest chambers, Sauron would appear to specially chosen prisoners in fair form, playing the role of a fellow captive who had glimpsed terrible truths. His words were like poison wrapped in honey. "Have you never wondered," he would ask softly, "why the Valar left us to suffer in Middle-earth while they dwell in bliss?" Each question was to plant doubt that would grow into a forest of betrayal. As the First Age unfolded, 2 distinct paths to dominion emerged. In Angband, Morgoth's fortress rang with the screams of those being transformed into orcs, the earth-shaking roars of dragons in their breeding pits, and the burning thunder of balrogs in its halls, a symphony of brute force and physical corruption. Meanwhile, in Tol in Garhoth, Sauron's halls echoed with something far more terrifying: quiet conversations. The master relied on force, the student found a way to bend wills. The siege of Angband, where the host of the Valar finally answered the desperate pleas of elves and men after centuries of torment and darkness, show how far their paths had diverged. Morgoth's response was predictably devastating. Dragons soaring from his gates, balrogs striding forth wreathed in flame, displays of overwhelming force that shook the very foundations of Arda. But with each grand display, each mountain cast down, each army raised, his inherent power diminished. The fires he commanded grew weaker. His dragons became creatures of mere flesh and bone that could be slain by mortal weapons. This diminishment was the price of his earliest choice: to pour his power into the very substance of Arda itself, weaving darkness and corruption into creation. In his desperate need to dominate the physical world, Morgoth had sacrificed the greater part of his original divine power, binding himself ever more tightly to the material realm he sought to rule. But in this way, Morgoth lost the greater part of his original angelic powers, of mind and spirit, while gaining a terrible grip upon the physical world. For this reason, he had to be fought, mainly by physical force, and enormous material ruin was a probable consequence of any direct combat with him, victorious or otherwise. Sauron, meanwhile, waged a different kind of war. His agents moved through the camps of the besieging armies, whispering old truths with new poison. Among the Noldor, they spoke of the kinslaying at Alqualond, rekindling ancient guilts. To the armies of men, they murmured about elven treachery, about how the firstborn would claim all of Middle-earth once Morgoth fell. These seeds of despair would later bloom into betrayals at the Nirnath Unwydiad, the battle of unnumbered tears, and Sauron's power only grew. In the forests of Dorthonion, his corrupted agents moved through villages bearing gifts of gold and silver, building networks of influence through years of patient manipulation. They identified those with grievances against their lords, those hungry for power, those susceptible to whispered promises. When Angban's forces finally moved against these realms, they found their work already done. Gates mysteriously opening from within, weapons subtly weakened, supply caches inexplicably empty. The student had learned what the master never could, that broken bones would heal and burnt flesh would scar over, but carefully planted doubts would grow stronger with each passing year. Sauron didn't need to break wills. He only had to bend it enough, and will breaks themselves. The fundamental weakness in Morgoth's approach became increasingly apparent as the First Age progressed. His method of dominion required constant displays of overwhelming force. Every slave in Angban's mines needed a whip at their back. Every servant required the constant threat of violence. Each great act of destruction came at a terrible price. When he destroyed the two trees of Valinor, he had to personally lead the assault, expending vast power in combat with Ungoliant. When he sought to break the siege of Angband throughout the decades, he unleashed everything at once, dragons in their full terror, Balrogs wreathed in flame, armies of wolves and orcs countless as autumn leaves. Each victory diminished him. This diminishment reached its tragic apex in Morgoth's duel with Fingolfin, High King of the Noldor. The Dark Lord who had once shaped mountains with a thought could no longer move with his former grace. Though he won the battle, Fingolfin's blade left 7 wounds that would never heal, and the king's final stroke lamed him forever. The truth became clear. Each act of destruction, each display of world-shattering power had required Morgoth to pour more of his native strength into Arda itself. The world became infused with what the wise would call the Morgoth element, discord woven into the very fabric of creation. While this meant all things could be corrupted, it left Morgoth himself increasingly weaken. Thus, outside the Blessed Realm, all matter was likely to have a Melkor ingredient, and those who had bodies nourished by the HROA of Arda had, as it were, a tendency, small or great, towards Melkor. From the shadows of Angband, Sauron watched his master's decline. He observed as Morgoth's throne room, once a place of terrible majesty filled with might, became a hollow mockery of its former grandeur. The being who had once challenged the armies of the Valar now huddled in his fortress depths, sending lesser creatures to do his bidding. By the time the host of Valinor came to cast him into the void, Morgoth could not even change his form, trapped in the shape of a dark king, terrible yet vulnerable. After Morgoth's defeat, Sauron retreated into the east, vanishing from the sight of elves and men for nearly 500 years. While the victorious Valar reshaped the broken world and established the realm of Numenor as a reward for faithful men, he wandered the vast lands of Middle-earth, plotting and preparing. In hidden places, he refined the insights gained from witnessing his master's fall, developing a vision of dominion that would prove far more sustainable than Morgoth's brute force. When Sauron's own time came in the Second Age, he concentrated it into a single perfect instrument, the One Ring. In Mount Doom's fires, he forged not just a weapon, but a vessel for his power that he could control absolutely. Where Morgoth had needed to personally oversee every major battle, Sauron could extend his will across vast distances through the 9 ring wraiths, each one a perfect extension of his dominion. Through this masterwork, he achieved what Morgoth never could: the ability to coordinate vast military campaigns and maintain control over territories far larger than his master had ever held, all while preserving his native strength. Consider their relative powers at their peaks. Morgoth, at the end of the First Age, still commanded awe-inspiring forces. When the host of the Valar finally came against him, he unleashed Ancalagun the Black, mightiest of all dragons, whose wings stretched from horizon to horizon, whose fire could melt the very towers of Thangorodrim. Yet Morgoth himself had become a shadow of his former glory, a dark spirit trapped in a form that could be wounded by mortal weapons. The Silmarils he had stolen burned his hands black, their holy light a constant torment he could not escape. The 7 wounds still bled without cease, his stride forever slowed by the laming blow. By contrast, Sauron at his height achieved greater power through subtlety and efficiency rather than raw might. Where Morgoth had commanded through displays of overwhelming force, Sauron wove webs of influence across Middle-earth through carefully chosen agents and well-placed words. His true mastery lay in the One Ring, which concentrated rather than dispersed his strength, allowing him to extend his will through layers of influence. From the 9 ring wraiths who served as his most powerful servants, to the networks of spies who whispered in the courts of kings, to the cults of fear and devotion he cultivated among conquered peoples. Even in direct confrontation, his power proved formidable. In the Battle of the Last Alliance, it took both Gil-galad with Aeglos and Elendil wielding Narsil to defeat his physical form. And even then, his spirit endured, protected by the ring's power. Sauron's relatively smaller power was concentrated. Morgoth's vast power was disseminated. The whole of Middle-earth was Morgoth's ring. Sauron's patience even brought the mightiest kingdom of men to its fall. When confronted by Numenor, the mightiest kingdom of men, he chose a path Morgoth could never have conceived: surrender. Where his master would have unleashed dragons and balrogs, as he had against Gondolin, Sauron allowed himself to be taken in chains to Numenor itself. Those chains, which he could have broken at any moment, became the instruments of his greatest triumph. In the courts of Ar-Pharazôn, his words dripped honey-sweet poison into eager ears. He praised the Númenóreans' achievements while stoking their pride, nurtured their fear of death while questioning the Valar's right to immortality. In the temples of Armenelos, he transformed their faith itself, turning worship into sacrifice, devotion into darkness. Within decades, Númenor's transformation was complete. The white tree Nimloth withered as smoke rose from sacrificial altars. The faithful fled or faced death, while ships that once carried explorers now returned laden with human tributes. When Ar-Pharazôn launched his doomed assault on Valinor, Sauron watched from the temple heights as Númenor sailed to its own destruction. A victory that rivaled what Morgoth had achieved, won through his enemies' own choices. Even their defeats illustrated their fundamental difference. When Morgoth was cast into the void, his power structure collapsed completely. Ancalagon's fall destroyed Angband itself. His dragons became mere beasts, his balrogs fled to the deep places of the earth, and his orcs devolved into squabbling raiders. The very land of Beleriand, saturated with his dispersed power, sank beneath the waves. A fitting epitaph for one who had poured his strength into the world itself. Even in defeat, the true mastery of Sauron's methods became clear. When Isildur's broken sword cut the One Ring from his hand, the machinery of his dominion continued turning with terrible efficiency. Barad-dûr stood unshaken, its foundations bound to the ring's power. The Nazgûl remained in their eternal service, bound by the rings of power. In Minas Morgul and Dol Guldur, his lieutenants continued their work of corruption and control, the great wheels of his influence turning without pause. From the frozen wastes of Forodwaith to the steaming jungles of Far Harad, his influence remained undiminished. The Haradrim and Easterlings stayed loyal, bound not by force but by generations of carefully cultivated hatreds and ancient treaties. His networks of spies and collaborators continued their shadow work, gathering intelligence, spreading careful lies, maintaining the structures of power he had built over millennia. Ultimately, the student surpassed the master by understanding that true dominion lay not in displays of power, but in the patient corruption of hearts and minds. Where Morgoth sought to dominate through overwhelming force, Sauron crafted a more insidious path, one that worked through whispered lies and careful manipulation, spreading like poison through his enemy's own choices and fears. And so, while Morgoth faded into legend as a tale of ancient terror, Sauron's darker art, the careful cultivation of doubt, pride, and betrayal, became a template for evil that would endure beyond ages in Middle-earth. What do you think? Did Sauron truly surpass Morgoth, or was he simply more efficient in his evil? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. Until next time, may the light of Erendil guide you through whatever shadows you face.